Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today for this IWF Reads Author Chat. I'm Claudia Rosett, Foreign Policy Fellow at the Independent Women's Forum, and I'm excited to join all of you today with our guest of honor, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, a woman I've admired for some 2 decades. Before bringing Ayaan on screen, I want to give you a few pointers on how to engage with us today on this platform. We have a chat room on the right side of your screen where you can join the discussion with other attendees and my IWF teammates who will have a T next to their names. If you don't see the chat room, just click on the arrow in the top right corner to open the chat window. And toward the end of our time with Ayaan today, we'll be drawing and announcing names to win 3 copies, signed copies of her book, Pray, Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. This is a terrific book, important. In order to win, you must be present during the drawing at the end of today's event, and the books will be mailed to our door prize winners. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest of honor, a few words about her. In this era of cancel culture and woke lockstep, Ayaan Hirsi Ali is one of the world's most courageous and determined voices for individual rights and freedoms, especially for women. Born in Somalia, raised as a devout Muslim, she began early on to think for herself, questioning Islam's many strictures on women. In 1992, Ayaan fled to the Netherlands, seeking asylum to save herself from a forced marriage. She learned Dutch, became a Dutch citizen, embraced the values of individual rights and freedoms, and in 2003 was elected to the Dutch parliament, where she worked on ways of integrating immigrants into Dutch society. She wrote the screenplay for a film titled Submission, about Islam's oppression of women. Her director, Theo van Gogh, was murdered and pinned to his body with a dagger with a letter talking about holy war and threatening death to Ayaan. A few years later, she moved to America. Here she has continued writing and speaking out in defense of the principles that underpin free societies, and especially the rights of women, a feminist in the truest and most admirable sense of the word. Today, she's a world-famous author and speaker, a fellow at the Hoover Institution. She has her own human rights foundation, the AHA Foundation, which, quote, believes in liberty for all. She is a wife and the mother of 2 young sons. At the Independent Women's Forum, we are longtime admirers of Ayaan, and in 2014 honored her with our award for Woman of Valor. Her latest book, which she'll be talking about with us today, is Pray. That's P-R-E-Y, Pray. Immigration, Islam, and the Erosion of Women's Rights. In it, Ayaan focuses on Europe, which opened the gates in 2015 to millions of migrants from the Middle East and North Africa, but failed to pursue policies that would integrate them into free societies. Instead, many of these immigrants, the great majority of them young Muslim men, have brought with them a culture that treats women not as equals, but as property, as targets for harassment, molestation, subjugation, humiliation, and worse. The result has been an erosion in Europe of the rights and freedoms of women, as it has become increasingly dangerous for them to dress as they please, go where they like, and say what they think. It is politically taboo to speak frankly about this terrible development. The politicians avoid it, the bureaucracies hide it, and the women who become targets are left with little justice and few champions. But Ayaan has stepped forward as a champion for them and for us. As the current US administration pursues policies that have produced a crisis on our own southern border, there are urgent lessons in her brilliant book and a warning not only for Europe, but for America. An immigrant herself, Ayaan does not oppose immigration per se. Her point is that it needs policies that integrate immigrants into free societies rather than importing the oppressive systems from which they fled. She begins with a heartfelt epigraph, standing politically correct culture on its head. Quote, "This is a trigger warning for the entire book. Reading it, you should be triggered." So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Ayaan, thank you for joining us.
Claudia, thank you very much for having me. Lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you. And may I start with a question for you about courage? In defending freedom and women's rights, you delve into subjects that many people who quietly agree with you are simply afraid to talk about in public, all the more so as cancel culture has increasingly gripped the US. What advice for our audience, for anyone in this position, would you offer to someone trying to find the courage to speak up, as you do, about the growing assaults on our freedom and especially on the rights and freedoms of women?
The advice I would offer would be to read about the history of people who found themselves in circumstances far worse than the one we are in right now. Think about it. If you were living in Germany, or by the way, in any part of Europe, in the years before the Second World War or during the Second World War, imagine that there were people under those circumstances who found the courage to not only speak up and speak out, but also help their fellow citizens escape the horrific reality of being sent to concentration camps and gas chambers and the like. Today, that's not what we are confronted with. We're confronted with, yes, being labeled xenophobic and racist. And I think it's a very serious thing that people are afraid of losing their livelihoods. That's a big deal. But I think the more of us who stand up and speak out in this early stage, before things get worse, I think we'd be able to salvage. You know, when I look back at all the history of various struggles for freedom, for equality, to prevent tyranny from taking over, or when people are tyrannized, the attempts to get rid of that. When I reflect on all of that, I think, oh my goodness, right now in America, we are really in a very, it's the very early stages of this totalitarian way of thinking. And the sooner we stand up, the sooner we voice the problems with this ideology, the better. So silence is better. Speaking up right now and organizing and getting together is much better, much more powerful than staying silent.
A question which speaks to the speed with which rights can be eroded. In your superb book, you make a very powerful case that the rights and liberties achieved by women in Europe are now being lost as this mass immigration of unassimilated people from the Middle East and North Africa brings those values to Europe, especially countries like Germany. And could you tell us, how quickly has this been happening? What's the speed? What should we be aware of as far as urgency here?
Well, in some countries, it's less than a decade. I think the Germans probably woke up to the problem in a very large way only in 2015 during the attacks in Cologne, when in 2015 there was a large number of asylum seekers who came into Europe. Many of them were from Syria, but many more were from other parts of the Middle East, from South Asia, from Africa. And it was almost like a switch flipped. Women who were used to going out on New Year's Eve to celebrate that, they call it Silvesternacht in Germany, did what they would do every year. Go out and revel and have fun, and yes, drink and celebrate the coming in of the new year. And in this particular year, about 1,200 women found themselves surrounded and attacked and harassed and groped, attempted rapes. They were robbed. What is the speed with which that could happen? Some social scientists will say it actually started in the 60s, because when the first guest workers came from North Africa, from the Middle East, from parts of the world where women are not seen as equal human beings, that's when it started, because the countries in Europe that invited these guest workers to come failed to assimilate them into their value systems. And when, after 1973, with the oil crisis, when there was an economic downturn in these countries in Europe, the immigrants who came did not go back home. Instead, they were actually allowed to bring their families to Europe, and they were allowed into the welfare state. And as they established themselves and as they settled, they were able to take advantage of the services of the welfare state and a stable political and economic society, or societies in Europe, But again, they weren't drawn into assimilating in the way that we think of assimilation. And when I talk about assimilation, I talk about assimilating into the value system, the laws, the norms, the values, the customs, not just, learning the language and having a job. Anyway, over time, those people who settled had children. And in this book, while I was doing research for this book, some of the perpetrators of the sexual violence that I chronicle in the book are not only committed by recent arrivals in the 2010s, but the children of people who arrived in the 60s and 70s. And so if you say at what speed, it depends on what you're looking at. This failure to assimilate immigrants, particularly immigrants from Muslim countries, that has been around for, well over 50 years. But in recent decades, because of the increase in numbers, the situation has become more pronounced. So the people, the communities that had already settled, those were not integrated or assimilated. And on top of that, you have these large numbers coming in. I left Europe in 2006. When I was going away, the debate within many of these European countries was, yes, we do have a problem with, they call it integration there, with integrating these communities, but time is going to solve the problem. Over time, they will adapt. They will come to understand that equal rights for women, equal rights for gay people, tolerance towards people of other religions, and people like me, individual Muslims who had decided to leave Islam, that would just, over time, things would get better. Now, I've been in the US for nearly 15 years, and I look back at what's happening in Europe, and yes, there is a form of adaptation that's happening, but it's not the immigrants who are adapting to Europe. It's the Europeans, especially the women, who are adapting, the ones who are confronted with the unintended consequences of immigration. They are the ones who are adapting to the norms and values of the immigrants. And I think that's tragic.
You you specifically mention in your book that all of this influx of non-integrated Muslims, which has been ended, which is now causing the erosion of women's rights in Europe, was ironically due to one woman, Angela Merkel. But to me, part of what that says is policy can have an enormous effect on accelerating or sort of mitigating that kind of trend. Could you tell us a little bit more about what happened? And I'm thinking over and over, your book is focused on Europe, but published here.
Yeah.
And it's written in English. In Europe, that would be a common language, but it's really an American audience here. This is a warning. This is a lesson. There are things you are telling us here. And maybe, are there any connections to be drawn between the policy with which Ms. Merkel triggered this huge influx as of 2015 and what we're now seeing with the new administration in the US?
So Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, she's an admirable woman, a strong woman, and she's done a great deal of good as a leader for Germany. But when it came to this particular point, I spoke during the course of researching for the book, I spoke to a number of German people, some of them highly placed journalists, some people in her own government. And the common theme, when I asked, what happened in 2015, what was this based on? What was the thought behind it? And each one of them said, it was thoughtless. There was no thought behind it. It's a kid who cried, and Angela Merkel started by explaining to the child why it was impossible to allow everyone from societies where civil disruption was going on, civil strife, why it was really difficult to bring them in. But when the child sobbed and all of these cameras were directed at her, then Angela Merkel spontaneously said, okay, we will then welcome everyone. And so when you use the word policy, a lot of these German people were explaining to me this wasn't policy. It was sentimental. It was emotional, which is noble. It's great to have to show your compassion, but as an elected leader, that's not how you make policy. And the parallels with the United States of America are people on the left, many of them, if we take them at their word, they're making a case for compassion. They're saying, get rid of the wall, get rid of the borders, let everyone come. But if you say that, there are consequences. There are people who are coming from societies where violence is the norm. The threshold for committing violent acts, especially against women, is very low. You have to take into consideration a whole host of very complex factors before you decide to do away with borders, before you decide to do away with ICE or any kind of restrictions on immigration. If you have legal immigration, where you select people, individuals, based on what they will bring to this society and how they can enrich our own society, and then how in return they can build for themselves a life worth living and worth pursuing, that exchange between the individual immigrant and the host society, based on that well thought through selection process, that's the kind of immigration that succeeds. That's the kind of immigration we want. But just having large swathes of people incentivized to leave their homeland in large numbers with children, with women, I think it's the wrong way to go about it. So there are parallels for the US. I think this kind of unmanaged, unruly immigration is not good for any society, and it's not good for the immigrants either, because we're actually sending, in my view, a fantasy notion that if you are in Guatemala or the Honduras or El Salvador, any of these countries, that you can drop everything and make your way to the border, and that your life is going to be different. And no one tells the people who are then subjected to people smugglers, sexual violence of all kind, children being orphaned, all of the dangers across in trying to make that trek. It's, I think, inhumane to do that to people, to incentivize them that way, and then when they come to the US, lock them up and return them. And it's just, I don't think it's a good way of going about. It's not good for the immigrants. It's not good for the host society.
May I ask you a question that draws on a word that's really not in fashion these days, but capitalism, free markets. At the beginning of the 19th century, we had huge immigration, my own ancestors among them, but they did not arrive to be embraced by a welfare state. They arrived to discover that, they knew, actually, they didn't discover, they knew the terms, that they had to work their way up. My great aunt worked in sweatshops, sewing clothes in New York. It was that kind of a life. And they did. And one of the things that this forced people to do was, in the course of actually doing business, people, whatever their prejudices, biases, and so on, have to make allowances for each other, have to deal on each other's terms. They had to learn English to rise in the country, to do well. They weren't given all sorts of guidance and help and so on. I don't know how we ever get back to that. We have a deeply entrenched welfare state right now, but I would welcome your thoughts on, you mentioned trying to link one sort of possible solution here, or way of addressing it would be trying to link who we admit into the country as an immigrant to how well they understand our system and appreciate it, what they, sort of interviews that actually give some idea of that. What are the ways that we can get back to the incentives where people are not simply arriving being embraced by a welfare bureaucracy that does very well out of all this. I mean, I keep wondering, what are the contractors being paid who are handling all those kids down at the border? Somebody ought to do that story. But can you talk a little bit about that? Can free markets ever redeem this?
Yes, and I think the way your question is phrased, it makes me think of two things. One is looking at the past. What is it that America did in the past, and what did it do very well when it comes to immigration policy? And what America did very well in the past, so that is learning from history, is that immigration to America was always selective. This kind of spontaneous arrivals of mass people, I think that is something that's relatively new because of the new technology, because transportation is cheaper and so on. So that is number one, learning from history. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? The other point that it makes me think about is America has the opportunity now to look at European countries, for instance, that are welfare states, and the way they've handled immigration, and especially the process of integration. Many European countries have allowed people to come into Europe and allowed them to go straight into accessing the services of the welfare state without at the same time saying, well, the welfare state is not something you can stay, you can't use those services permanently. And so it's a good opportunity for American policymakers to go and look at what is it that these European countries have done right and what is it that they have done wrong. And what they will find is that by giving the impression that there are these endless resources available to people, that they can just have free healthcare, free food, free education, free this, that, and the other, and that they are not required to contribute to that. If you look at the consequence of that, the ghetto forming, and large numbers of kids, especially boys, dropping out within these immigrant communities, dropping out of school, getting into trouble with the law, the entrenching of within these ghettoized communities, radical Islamic leadership coming in and turning these communities away from the values of the host societies. It would be good for American policymakers to travel to these places and educate themselves on what policies are good and what are bad, which ones are bad, and also learn from our history. And I think you will then arrive at a point where you can develop sensible, reasonable, and successful policies. And when I talk about successful, I mean for the country itself, for the US itself, but also for the immigrants that are selected to come, give them the best opportunity to make something of their lives.
Thank you. That's more hopeful than I was. More hopeful than I was expecting, and very good to hear as far as a chance. Yeah. Can I go back to your book for a minute, because I want to give people a sort of further feel of what you wrote about there, and then I want to go back to the future. But one of the most chilling chapters in your book is titled, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Taharush Gamia, the rape game. Perfect.
Which is Gamia is the way the Egyptians pronounce it, and then some of in the Gulf Arabic they pronounce it as Jamia, but it means the same thing.
Thank you. And in this chapter, you tell in brief but horrifying detail, one after another, the individual stories of women sexually assaulted by asylum-seeking men within the past 6 years in Germany, Italy, France, Sweden, Austria, Hungary, and Denmark. And one of the most intriguing points you make, and this speaks to cultural differences where societies have been on very different trajectories and then collide, as you also write about, is the assumption of the attacker that these assaults were not solely sexual in nature. They were proprietary. In other words, the assumption of the attackers being that women are not equals, but property. For something like that, once people have arrived, how do you go about changing that? This is sort of a further question on integration.
Yeah, I think the first step is to try and understand it. And in order to understand it, you have to understand where do these young men come from? What's their context? What are the attitudes that these young men are raised with towards women? And it is property. These are societies that have, polygamy is the norm. Women are shrouded and covered from head to toe. The society is divided. Women are seen as either good women or bad women. Good women are virtuous, they're chaste, they're obedient, they're submissive, they stay at home, they cover themselves, they always have chaperones with them, and so on. Bad women, on the other hand, they dress as they please, they seek to work outside of the house, they demand that they have an education. So the more assertive, the more, westernized a woman is, the more she is regarded as immodest and unvirtuous, unchaste, and bad, and ready for the taking. And so once you educate yourself on the culture and the context that these young men are coming from, and when they come into Europe, what their prejudices are towards women, I think only then can you then develop the programs, which in many, as you know, you've lived in the Netherlands, in many of these countries, these educational programs are provided and they're free of charge. But then you want to develop the content. What is it that we want to teach these young people? Unfortunately, Claudia, as you also know, in many of these countries, simply educating yourself on the culture and the religion and the background of asylum seekers and other immigrants has been rendered taboo. Yeah. To do that and to understand it and to say it's different and it will clash with European norms, that is wrong. Because if you do that, you're engaging in ethnocentric behavior, Eurocentric behavior. You're a colonizer. You're thinking of colonizing them. You look at, this is all shrouded in taboo and in irrelevant arguments, and so the problems get bigger and bigger. But if you were to adopt a rational position, you would say, well, here are our norms and values, and we're even happy to teach you, to educate you on those. But there are consequences if you violate those. And right now, Europe is not there. I think that France, Denmark, and Austria have taken steps, as you will see in the book, to try and correct for what went wrong in the past, try and assert these values with confidence. But it's an uphill road. Some of the other countries in Germany, they haven't even started because of Germany's past. And in some ways, I think we don't understand it, but America and American culture influences the rest of the world, and Europe in particular, what we now call cancel culture or wokeism. My son calls it Woke-19 after COVID-19. This is going across the Atlantic to European countries. And so this relativism of looking at groups and thinking of our society as made up of groups that relate to one another as oppressors and victims, that whole thing is also now has made its way to Europe. So it's making things even more difficult. I don't know if you were aware of the fact that the French president said, no, we don't want this woke postmodernist philosophy coming to us, forgetting that actually postmodernism was born in France. But in any case, I think that with these difficulties, with cancel culture, with this moral relativism that's been going on for a long time, I don't know if the phrase multiculturalism is familiar to our audience, but when I lived in the Netherlands and we talked about the process of integration, it would always be frustrated by people coming in and saying, well, we have to adhere to the philosophy of multiculturalism, which entails that you respect the culture of immigrants. And so if that is the attitude, if all cultures are the same and we're obliged to respect their culture and their values and their norms, then there is no point in having a conversation about what kinds of values that they would be integrating to. All values were rendered to be equal. All values were similar. And now we are witnessing as I write in the book, what happens when you take that position, real human suffering, women being raped, being gang raped, being harassed, being groped, and being put in a position where they're afraid for their own safety in the public space.
This is why your book is so important and so valuable. You're talking about things that people are afraid to talk about. You've done it. You've done it for years, but this really lays out something important. I want to ask you a final question that's really sort of an invitation for any closing remarks, but sort of on a personal level. Your life has been quite a story. Started in Somalia, you've moved on, and you've seen and you have lived the things that you were writing about in Europe. You lived there for years. You became a member of the Dutch Parliament. Now in America, you're seeing our cancel culture. That's what you're going up against. That's what you confront when you go out to, when you were going out to do public speeches and so on. Could you tell us a little bit, as Ayaan Hirsi Ali, girl from Somalia, woman from the Dutch Parliament, American woman today, and a mother, when you look at where things came from, and then you look out at the horizon, over the next 10, 20 years, raising your children, where is this going, and what are the most important things? We can whittle it down to just a few things that we can do in this huge, crazy world against this cancel culture right now. Where does this go?
So cancel culture reminds me of my past. My past is tribal. I grew up in tribal societies, in clan societies where, we were divided into groups. And in our case, it was along your bloodline, and you are loyal to those people. You're suspicious of the other. You don't trust them. And you always think that they're out to get you, and they think the same of you. And cancel culture seems to be taking us there, taking us backwards to a primitive way of living. I think that most people are intimidated, but I don't really think that most Americans have actually bought into this ideology. It's a very small but very loud minority that is pushing this. And I see no other way for our American future than to stop this ideology in its tracks. And the way to do it is to speak up. It's to expose how illiberal it is. A lot of people say, oh, it's the liberals. There is nothing liberal about cancel culture and the woke. It is conformist. It's punitive. It is, in many ways, I know Americans are actually not familiar with the state of fascism, but it is fascistic in its thinking. And it really is, if this thing spreads the way it's been spreading, if this gets into the mainstream, then we're in big trouble. What is in the mainstream now is that people are afraid to stand up to it, but I don't think they've really bought into it, that they believe in it. But really it is time, and I am committed to fighting it as much as I can, especially with young children. And if you look at what this woke philosophy, the way it's being applied in elementary school, high school, it started in the colleges, and we thought it would be just a fringe group there, but it's not. It's now spread all across. It's gone to the administrative state of the government and various levels of government. It's in our culture. I mean, books, movies, songs and everything. It's just terrible. And the only thing that we can really do, what makes America unique, is once we recognize these terrible ideas, we get up and we stand up to these bullies. And that's the way, really, their way of advancing their beliefs and their points of view is through bullying. It's through shutting everyone up. And I'm very much familiar with that, obviously, with my Muslim background. But this is a threat from within, And it is something, we can't blame this on external forces. It's something we're doing to ourselves. And it's something we really have to get up. I really call on men, women, if you're a parent, this is not something that's going to go away. It's affecting all of us right now, and it will continue to affect us. And the only thing I can say is let's stand together against this thing. It doesn't matter whether you're a conservative or a liberal. If you're a sane American and you want what is good for you and your children and for our society, we need to stand up to this thing.
Ayaan, thank you for inspiring and sane and perceptive and brilliant and brave remarks. May I ask you to stay with us for just one more minute? We have a drawing. We want to announce the winners of the signed copies of your book. I encourage everyone to read this. It is truly an important book to know. The winners today are Lisa Merriam, Whitney Van Vactor, and Sanders Thompson. Our Independent Women's Forum teammates will follow up with the winners to get copies to each of you. And Ayaan, thank you. It's been a real pleasure and a great honor, our Women of Valor, to talk with you today. We're so glad that you could join us, share your insights with readers, and discuss your new book. And we wish you all the best and great success in the future. We're with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Claudia. And thank you to the entire community. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Now, before everyone else goes, I have a few closing remarks I'd like to make to everyone before signing off. I just want to mention that next month we'll be discussing another terrific book, Everything Will Be Okay, with #1 New York Times bestselling author Dana Perino, hosted by the IWF's brilliant Jennifer Braceras. Sign up for that on IWF Author Chats. We look forward to seeing you there. If you haven't already, please join our exclusive Facebook group called IWF Reads Book Club. It's a private group just for our IWF Read members like you. It's a great way to keep up with our books and events and to engage with other IWF Reads members. I'd also like to tell you a bit more about the Independent Women's Forum. IWF is the leading national women's organization dedicated to developing and advancing policies that enhance people's freedom, choices, and well-being. We have an amazing staff of all women, some of the sharpest policy communications and legal minds in the country. We testify before Congress and state legislatures, produce educational materials, and published articles about various policy issues, file amicus briefs in various court cases, and frequently interface with the media to make the case for better public policy. We also make a point to champion women from across the country, celebrating their accomplishments and lives. If you haven't read our inspiring champion women profiles, I hope you'll check them out on IWF.org under the About tab. We release a new profile every 2 weeks. Check out our website for more information and a lot of new daily content, IWF.org. I also hope you'll sign up to become an email subscriber and even a mobile insider for special text alerts, and you can get the latest news, updates, and events from the IWF. And with that, it's time for me to adjourn and say goodbye. Thank you all so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed it. We wish you a great week in spring and hope to see you soon again. Bye-bye.